Mental health care systems in the United States have undergone significant change throughout the years as we struggle to find solutions that ensure patients' rights while acknowledging the federal government's responsibility to help the severely mentally ill. A key piece of legislation in this process was the Community Mental Health Act, signed into law by John F. Kennedy in 1863. The act began the process of deinstitutionalization, closing down large insane asylums and shifting towards community-based care. While it improved the lives of many people, the act and subsequent legislation had unanticipated consequences, such as the high rates of homelessness and incarceration of mentally ill people that we see today. The first insane asylums in America were built by the Quakers in the 18th century to provide more humane treatment to the mentally ill. With a limited knowledge of the causes of mental illness, the focus was mainly placed on keeping the mentally ill taken care of and out of sight. By the end of the 19th century, demand for asylums had grown exponentially. As more and more mental hospitals were needed, the conditions of those built deteriorated. Forced institutionalization was also used as a tool to control women who defied social norms. Outspoken, independent women could be labeled as morally insane, a diagnosis invented by James Cowles Pritchard in 1835. Elizabeth Packard, for example, had become a prominent critic against this practice after she had been detained in an insane asylum for merely standing up to her husband. Yet most of these voices were silenced, and for many years, most Americans remained largely indifferent to the extent of the abuses of the asylum system. In 1887, an investigative reporter named Nellie Bly set out to get herself committed to Blackwell's Island, an insane asylum. Her two-part journalistic series, 10 Days in a Madhouse, was a graphic expose of the asylum's deplorable conditions. Physical abuse was common, as well as unsanitary conditions and inedible food. It led to widespread criticism of insane asylums and mounting dissatisfaction with the current system. But the few reforms that resulted, such as better sanitation, nutrition, and clothing, were not enough to fix the issues, and the number of patients locked in mental hospitals continued to grow. By the mid-1900s, patient numbers were at their peak, and cracks in the system were starting to show. Large-scale mental hospitals were expensive, and the outcomes of patients were growing worse. Overwhelmed with the number of patients, doctors often relied on the new psychiatric wonder drugs of the day, like Thorazine. For some, this method of treatment caused even more problems.
My mother, Dorothy Lorla, was sexually molested from a young age. As she grew older and faced severe depression and other mental health issues, she was prescribed a variety of psychiatrist medications. Many of these did not work well together and increased her erratic behavior. She became addicted to these drugs and in response was institutionalized many times throughout her adult life. These did not help her, and if anything, worsened her condition.
Dorothy Lorla was one of many mental health patients at that time that were heavily drugged, oftentimes with dire consequences. But the late 1950s and early 60s brought new ideas about mental health treatment into the national conscience. Patient rights became a more prominent concern, and the ability of both the government and patients' family members to force citizens to get treatment was questioned. Debate over the ethics of involuntary hospitalization circulated the medical and political sphere.
My view is that if individuals do not injure or threaten to injure others, help, medical, psychiatric help should be offered to them. But under no circumstances will it be justifiable to coerce them.
Many even began to question the idea that huge inpatient treatment facilities were the only viable option. Governmental organizations like the National Institute on Mental Health pushed the legislature to enact change, as well as mental health professionals turned advocates for this cause. And thanks to JFK's election in 1960, America found itself with a president who also supported change within the mental health system, and he soon established a president's panel to prepare a plan to combat mental illness. Their subsequent report in 1962 outlined 112 recommendations concerning research, treatment, and education in the sphere of mental health.
I have sent to the Congress today a series of proposals to help fight mental illness and mental retardation.
The Community Mental Health Act was signed into law after passing easily through Congress, ushering in a new era for those with mental illness. It focused on recentering mental health care on the community level and gave grants to states who established community mental health centers in anticipation of the release of patients from insane asylums. This was also a major shift in terms of funding, as in the past, mental institutions had been primarily funded by the states, but with these new centers, the federal government took over more responsibility. A sense of hope swept across the nation, and America looked forward to a future with progressive new treatments, where the terrible conditions of the past could be left behind. The transition from insane asylums to community treatment centers was huge and could not be done hastily. President Carter and his administration aimed to further aid these developing centers. The Mental Health Systems Act of 1980, less than 20 years after the original act, aimed to expand services as well as allocate more funding. But the election of 1980 soon dashed their hopes. Running on a platform of federal spending reduction, Reagan intended to slash many federally funded projects, including mental health programs. Under the Reagan administration, the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981 was passed. This act repealed both the funding for the Community Mental Health Act of 1963 and the Mental Health Systems Act of 1980. Because the Community Mental Health Act had led to the federal government taking over funding for mental health, states were suddenly left unprepared and without state or federal funds. In addition, the suddenly stranded community treatment centers were not ready for the severity of the mental illness they were facing.
And by the time my work involved these transitions out of state institutions and back to a community, the people who were easiest to discharge from a state institution and reincorporate into a community had already come home and were doing okay. And so as time passed and more challenging people were being discharged back into the community, an assertive community treatment team was really the tool to make that happen.
Many of their best treatment plans for those with severe mental illness were expensive, and the community treatment centers often didn't have the resources. Furthermore, only half of the proposed community centers outlined in the Community Mental Health Act were actually built. People began to slip through the cracks. With nowhere to go, many with the most severe mental illnesses became unhoused, and homelessness doubled in the 1980s. Today, 77% of the unhoused have experienced mental illness at some point in their lives. Without any form of treatment, they often end up arrested and even incarcerated. 1 in 3 inmates at Illinois Cook County Jail, one of the largest jails in America, are mentally ill. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, estimates that between 25% and 40% of all mentally ill Americans will be jailed or incarcerated at some point in their lives. Many individuals who are declared mentally incompetent to stand trial are housed in county jails due to the lack of hospital beds. Patients are waiting for weeks in emergency rooms and jails, waiting for spots at psychiatric facilities to open up. Lawmakers are scrambling to find solutions, and for some, this means a return to the old systems. There has recently been a push to re-establish large mental institutions.
You know, in the 1960s, liberals emptied our psych wards, only to fill our streets and ultimately our prisons with the mentally ill.
And for those who are severely mentally ill and deeply disturbed, we will bring them back to mental institutions where they belong.
These ideas are at odds with the recommendations from the World Health Organization, which state that community-based services are better equipped to identify mental health concerns at an early stage. Plus, they alleviate the burden on emergency services and reduce the overall cost of mental health care. Critics of mental hospitals originally pushed for a new system based inside of the community, but without actual infrastructure, these ideas could only go so far. The Community Mental Health Act sought to restore rights to those with mental illness, but the federal government quickly abdicated its responsibility to fund care and treatment for its most vulnerable citizens. The story of mental health reform in America is one of good intentions undermined by a lack of follow-through. The legacy of the Community Mental Health Act is a complex one. At once a step towards progress, yet its unintended consequences have persisted. As we face this ongoing issue of mental illness, homelessness, and incarceration, the question remains, will we learn from the past or continue to repeat it?